Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. My name is Luke Corbin. It's Friday the 6th of August, and today we're bringing you a seminar that was recorded at the Myanmar Update Conference last month. This seminar is titled The Pendulum of Neutralism, Myanmar's Shifting Approach to Non-Alignment from 2010 to 2020. And it was presented by two presenters. The first, Dr. Andrea Passeri from the University of Malaya, and the second, Hunter Marston, PhD candidate at the Australian National University. Both are introduced by Mark Purcell, the CEO of the Australian Council for International Development. And following their talk, there's a brief Q&A. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello, my name is Mark Purcell. I'm from the Australian Council for International Development. Hunter Marston from ANU, currently a PhD candidate, and Andrea Passeri from the University of Malaya, a postdoctoral fellow on the Pendulum of Neutralism, Myanmar's Shifting Approach to Non-Alignment from 2010 to 2020. And Andrea is going to start off the presentation, and then Hunter is going to join him to complete. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, thanks for allowing us to share the preliminary results of what's still ongoing research to which we devoted lots of time and energy over the course of the last months. As you can tell from the title, our presentation revolves around Myanmar's recent foreign policy trajectory, and most notably its shifting application of the concept of non-alignment. And what really persuaded us to dive into this topic was the realization that since its very establishment as a sovereign country, Myanmar's foreign policy has been relentlessly shaped by one overarching goal, which is safeguarding the country's autonomy, independence, and room for maneuver amidst great power rivalries. This purpose, however, has been pursued in different and sometimes actually opposite ways. And against this backdrop, we can argue that historically, the evolution of Myanmar foreign policy has resembled the motion of a pendulum, swinging back and forth between two prototypes, two ideal types of alignment policy, which we labeled as positive non-alignment and negative neutralism. Positive non-alignment is activist, multi-directional in reaching out to international partnerships, and essentially pursues independence via diplomatic diversification. On the other hand, negative neutralism is reactive, introvert, and seeks to assert independence and autonomy through disengagement and self-aloofness. Besides that, these two ideal types can be distinguished also according to other criteria. So, for instance, positive non-alignment can be portrayed as quite enthusiastic when it comes to multilateral involvement, and definitely in favor of market economy and the consolidation of complex interdependencies with the outside world. Whereas, on the other hand, negative neutralism is quite diffident when it comes to multilateralism and tends to flirt with self-reliance and autarkic formulas in the economic realm. On top of that, positive non-alignment also shares many similarities with the concept of hedging. The former was designed to navigate the waters of the bipolar confrontation, and then its logic gradually evolved in the strategic blueprint embodied by the notion of hedging. And essentially, they both prescribe to sort of fluctuate between different great power orbits without becoming too over-dependent on a single diplomatic interlocutor. Edging, additionally, can be seen as an updated version of positive non-alignment that has become increasingly popular in Southeast Asia due to its multipolar structure, where secondary actors can experience less pressure to commit to one side versus the other, and also have more options to play great powers off on selected issues. So to go back to our research, the objective essentially was A, to understand and periodize when Myanmar shifted from one form of non-alignment to the opposite, and B, to explain why did these shifts take place. And in order to do so, we developed an analytical framework which is based on the following key hypotheses. In the absence of major external shock, which may dictate different course of action, small powers alignment choices are primarily determined by the overall degree of political legitimation held by their leaderships. And by political legitimation, we refer to the currency, so to say, that allows a ruling elite to justify their authority to rule and win the hearts and minds of domestic constituencies. And in this perspective, the political science literature tells us that rulers can cultivate and maximize their political legitimation via different legitimation pathways or sources. And in our study, we actually borrowed Leslie Holmes' classification, which divides legitimation sources into two general categories, namely internal and external sources of legitimation. Domestic legitimation modes include, for instance, performance-driven authority, procedural or democratic authority, and charismatic authority, just to name a few. And in addition to that, it can be also increased through the so-called particularistic narratives, such as nationalism. On the other hand, international legitimation can be secured through A, formal recognition from other states, and B, informal support. The latter, most notably, grows when other countries back the foreign policy agenda of a given leadership or regime, encouraging it to retain confidence in its own project and right to rule. And of course, political legitimation can experience both quantitative or qualitative metamorphosis. And when this happens, these transformations actually trigger a shift in small powers alignment choices, for instance, when choosing between various different strands or variants of non-aligned behavior. So the question is, how do we connect the degree of political legitimacy held by a given leadership with the resulting foreign policy blueprint that is selected by the same leadership? And in this perspective, our argument postulates that in the absence, once again, of major external shocks, this choice will be mostly dependent upon the degree of political legitimation held by the leadership. This means that high political legitimation translates into a higher degree of diplomatic proactiveness and vice versa. When it comes to diplomatic proactiveness, we define this attribute as the predisposition or lack of a certain state to pursue a dynamic foreign policy which is capable of dealing in advance with expected challenges in the attempt of actively addressing a country's security dilemma. So it's a parameter that allows us to differentiate between proactive and reactive states. According to Kent Calder's definition, reactive states are international actors that fail to undertake meaningful independent foreign policy initiatives, that respond to outside pressures erratically and look at the international arena essentially as a source of scrutiny or perils. Contrarily, proactive small states try to actively address their security dilemma. They engage with enthusiasm in multilateralism and try to play a bridging role amongst great powers' perils. So as a result, our model contends that a small actor that is interested in safeguarding autonomy vis-a-vis great power and benefits from a high level of political legitimation will arguably feel confident enough to tilt towards positive non-alignment. On the other hand, when political legitimation is low, the leadership will likely rely on a more reactive, introverted, and defensive blend of neutralist posture. So this is the graphical representation of our model. We have two parameters or attributes, namely the degree of diplomatic proactiveness showcased by a state and level of political legitimacy enjoyed by their leadership. These two parameters have a positive correlation and in turn affect the alignment choices of small powers interested in safeguarding independence vis-a-vis great powers. This model has been tested against the background of Myanmar's foreign policy record, and now Hunter will guide you through our periodization and our preliminary findings. Hunter, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. Right, thank you very much, everyone, for listening and joining online and from around the world. Andrea has presented our analytical framework, and I should note before moving into our individual period case studies that we tie the concept of negative neutralism and non-alignment back into some of Myanmar's historical roots, Burma's formulation of neutralism and non-alignment during the Cold War, before coming to the contemporary era, which we're really trying to focus on by comparing the consecutive administrations of the USDP from 2011 to 2016 and the NLD years from 2016 to 2021, with sort of an update to the paper now looking at Myanmar's foreign policy post-coup. So firstly, I won't read the entire contents of the screen, which you're no doubt digesting a bit of, but to rehash some of Andrea's analytical conceptual framework here. The Thein Sein administration came in with performance-driven political legitimacy at home, ushering in economic and political reforms while drawing on increased international support to legitimate its rule in the international realm. The overall trend during these years, we see political legitimation on the rise compared to the previous SLORC SPDC era, and the alignment choice of the USDP as a result, what we see is a positive non-alignment and a more creative, proactive form of hedging, along with indirect defiance of China. Consider, for example, the 2011 suspension of the Myitsone Dam. Thein Sein showed that he was willing to take more risks to wean his country off of reliance on China and Chinese investment and diplomatic protection. During the NLD years, which we have split into two different periods distinctly before and after the Rohingya crisis, we see different forms of political legitimation, both domestically and internationally. In the first part, Aung San Suu Kyi comes to power with a great deal of domestic popular support, a charismatic leader, promising to continue political reforms, strong backing from the West, and the trend of overall political legitimation is increasing. What we see is a similar continuity from the Thein Sein years in foreign policy of non-alignment and active hedging, proactive participation in regional forum. And at the same time, Aung San Suu Kyi adopts a more pragmatic relationship with China to invite increased foreign direct investment from Beijing. After the Rohingya crisis in 2016, 2017, Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD's international legitimacy takes a big hit. We see increased separation from Western countries. And at the same time, domestically, the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi are relying on a more Burma nationalist form of charisma, along with a pro-military stance to sort of safeguard their own party from attack from the ultra-conservatives. Overall, in this period, we see declining political legitimation, both domestically or more internationally than domestically. But domestically, Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD's tactics have shifted to different sources of political legitimation based on nationalism primarily. In the wake of the coup, we see increased negative neutralism, further isolationism, and a return to reliance primarily on China and Russia for diplomatic protection, along with more selective forms of investment and trade abroad. To look at the Thein Sein years, and I'll be cognizant of time, I've already recounted a bit of the pragmatic approach to foreign policy, balancing relationship with China with that of Western partners to increase Myanmar's autonomy and independence in the international realm. At the same time, economic and political reforms lead to the relaxation of sanctions, and the overall political legitimation of Myanmar's USDP party increases slowly during these years. Multi-party elections in 2015 strengthen its international legitimacy, and the NLD administration comes to power in 2016 based on an election manifesto promising an active and independent foreign policy, emphasizing regional cooperation with multilateral organizations such as the United Nations and ASEAN, and emphasizing the role of civil society. At the same time, as I've already noted, Aung San Suu Kyi has a pragmatic relationship with Beijing, traveling to China several times, twice for Belt and Road forums to solicit further investment from China. In the wake of the Rohingya crisis, Aung San Suu Kyi starts to skip international summits, including the UN General Assembly in 2017, and the following April 2018, skipping ASEAN Summit in Singapore. She continues to travel to China for forums such as the Belt and Road, and travels to The Hague, notably at the end of 2019, to defend Myanmar against charges against the military for its crimes in Rakhine State against Rohingya ethnic minority. In 2019 to 2020, this trend of increased reliance on Chinese investment is pretty evident in the form of 40% of all foreign direct investment in the country coming from China. Notably in 2020, Xi Jinping visits Myanmar, first time in almost 2 decades that a Chinese leader has visited the country. And the two countries agree to a Sino-Myanmar community of common destiny, which is in some ways indicative of Myanmar's gravitation back towards this toward Chinese influence. And then indicative of the trend of xenophobia, which we associate with negative neutralism. Aung San Suu Kyi approves a Western border wall, ostensibly to prevent incoming Muslim immigration from Bangladesh and the return or repatriation of Rohingya refugees. Along these lines, the economy starts to decline as Myanmar is becoming more isolated on the world stage. Foreign direct investment declines after 2017's high, and at the same time, gross domestic product starts to slow. Post-coup, the economy has gone further, is now in shambles as the electrical grid has started to encounter problems. People are not paying bills for obvious reasons. The military is rounding up numerous people, critics, and really just clamping down on the media as the country's junta draws increasingly inwards while still relying on traditional partners like Russia and China for patronage. To recount the big picture here, our argument is that various sources of political legitimation have narrowed, and Myanmar's foreign policy has shifted from a proactive phase, probably best exhibited between 2011-2016, creatively hedging between great powers, to one now that is essentially inward-looking, reactive, and championing economic autarky at home, along with repressive social policies. I think I will leave it there in the interest of time. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Hunter and Andrea, for a really persuasive theoretical analysis and then bringing it to reality with that matching up with different phases of Myanmar foreign policy. We've got a question here from an anonymous attendee. Can the panel comment on the different views of countries, UN and China in relation to ASEAN's engagement in the crisis in Myanmar? Hunter, would you like to take a stab at that, and perhaps with your colleague Andrea as well?
Sure, happy to have a start at this one. The different views and approaches of Western countries, the United Nations and China in relation to ASEAN efforts. One point I would have emphasized in the past, and perhaps there's more divergence now, is actually that the United States and China and some other countries, external partners or countries, actually sort of align in that they support the ASEAN diplomacy towards the Myanmar crisis. So I think the international community actually has some more unity than differences on this matter. It's really within ASEAN and within some multilateral fora like the UN Security Council where you start to see divisions that really have prevented further progress. And in ASEAN, that tends to be between the democracies such as Indonesia and the autocracies like Thailand that have not been able to come together to designate a special envoy, for instance.
I guess that right now we are also perceiving a rising degree of disillusion and frustration in certain Western capitals due to the lack of progress after the formulation of the ASEAN's 5-point consensus. There has been a little bit of stalemate after the agreement, and this is definitely something that frustrates Western stakeholders, which are not completely used to the principles that shape ASEAN's internal diplomacy.
Now we've got a question in the room. Would you like to say, and I'll come up here and...
So the question is actually for Hunter and Andrea's presentation. It was the chart of the representation of legitimacy. I guess my question is that there's a discrepancy in the perspectives of legitimacy between domestic and foreign audiences. And so, the popular media had said that during the Rohingya crisis, NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi were enjoying an increase in domestic legitimacy because they were satisfying, the national interests of Myanmar constituencies. Whereas internationally, they were cognizant that they were losing international legitimacy. So I'm just trying to figure out how that formula was working on that diagram that you had, that linear plot, because it showed that they were working in tandem, but it seems like they, based on what had happened over the past few years, domestic and international perspectives of legitimacy were going in opposite directions, right? So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the great question. Actually, what we argue is that the watershed embodied by the Rohingya crisis led to first metamorphosis in the sources of legitimation cultivated by Aung San Suu Kyi. So as Hunter was explaining, there was a shift towards nationalism and the idea of cultivating and maximizing even more Aung San Suu Kyi's charismatic figure, especially vis-a-vis Bamar constituencies. But on the same time, we also think that overall the degree of political legitimation retained by the Aung San Suu Kyi administration took a very hard hit. And so in terms of comprehensive political legitimation, both domestic and international. There was a decline that pushed Aung San Suu Kyi to resort to a more defensive, reactive blend of neutralism. Maybe Hunter wants to add something else on it.
Yeah, I think Andrea addressed that pretty well. But the other point I would point out, I think you're referring to the XY axis graph, which doesn't reflect time. It's purely the legitimation and the proactiveness of a foreign policy. So the NLD administration along that graph, if we were to chart a point, it might have actually not changed significantly if say the domestic legitimation were to increase even as the international legitimation decreased. Obviously, these are impossible to measure precisely, but that foreign policy dependent variable would still remain the same.
Thanks to all of our fantastic panelists. I think you'll agree that the diversity of their analysis has been the strength of this session.